Truth and Reconciliation in Childcare. How Are We Moving Forward? By Maria Sergeyev. Before looking at where we stand and how we move forward, we should look back at our past. The Indian Act was created in 1876 by the federal government of Canada. The purpose of this law was to civilize the savages, or in other words, to colonize indigenous people and remove their culture. This act was rooted in the 1850s Act for the Better Protection of the Lands and Property of the Indians in Lower Canada. This law stated the requirements for a person to be considered Indian. Losing your Indian status meant losing certain rights, such as the right to live on reserve. First Nations could lose their Indian status if they graduated from university, married a settler, became Christian minister, doctor, or lawyer. This section was not removed until 1961. That's only 61 years ago. The 1876 Indian Act gave the government and the Department of Indian Affairs powers regarding First Nations identity, politics, cultural practices, and education. They basically could not govern themselves or make any decisions for themselves without governmental approval. Subsequent amendments required First Nation children to attend residential schools. After receiving negative international attention, the Government of Canada came up with the White Paper of 1969. It was an intention to remove the Indian status and the Department of Indian Affairs. This would have removed any previous legal documents relating to Indigenous peoples in Canada, including the Indian Act and treaties. People protested against the law, which resulted in its withdrawal a year later. 12 years ago, the federal government announced their intention to work with Indigenous peoples to remove part of the Indian Act that gives authority to residential schools and authority to remove children from their homes. Although it has been amended over the years, the Indian Act still exists and outlines the terms of Indian status. Residential schools were developed by Catholic missionaries to provide childcare and education and were funded by the federal government. Their intention was to assimilate Indigenous children into the settlers' culture and provide sort of a final solution. The first residential school in Canada opened in 1831. The last residential school in Canada closed in 1997. That's only 25 years ago. These schools stripped Indigenous children of their identity, culture, and community. Many students suffered mental, physical, verbal, and sexual abuse. More than 6,000 Indigenous children died in residential schools. We may never know the real numbers. Unmarked children's graves and remains continue to be found to this day. I added the numbers of years that have passed since those legislations and events took place to show that this part of our history is very much alive. The Iroquois 7-generation principle states that decisions we make today impact us 7 generations into the future. These laws and regulations affected many generations. The intergenerational trauma caused by them and the residential schools is still present. Many Indigenous peoples have lost their language and culture, and that's why Truth and Reconciliation in Childcare matters. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was established in 2008. It was formed to inform all Canadians about the residential school system. In 2015, the Commission released its final report, which included 94 calls for action. Some calls related explicitly to child welfare and education. The idea is for the government to work with Indigenous peoples to educate the next generations and integrate Indigenous knowledge and culture into the curriculum. Currently, education falls within the provincial government's responsibility. The Childcare and Early Year Act 2014 states that every childcare center and home childcare agency must have a program statement. The program statement must be consistent with How Does Learning Happen? Ontario's Pedagogy for the Early Years 2014, and follow the 4 foundations: belonging, well-being, engagement, and expression. Early childhood educators enjoy the freedom to create a curriculum of their choice as long as it follows How Does Learning Happen? Currently, the available sources for early childhood educators do not include Indigenous views or knowledge. In 2021, the Ontario government made it mandatory to teach about residential schools beginning in grade 1. They also started writing a new curriculum for elementary and high schools with Indigenous leaders. Now, while teaching preschoolers about residential schools may be challenging, there are many other ways to introduce Indigenous knowledge Connecting children with the land is one way, sharing Indigenous books and stories is another. Including Indigenous knowledge in how this learning happened and the classroom is a way of decolonization and reconciliation. Indigenization of the materials sends a message that Indigenous families and children matter, and that they are a living part of our society, not just a part of our history that we would like to forget. When browsing through the many newsletters I have signed up for, no newsletter explicitly discussed truth and reconciliation in childcare. The AECO hosted a webinar called Reimagining Relationship to the Land Through Natural Curiosity, and it was Indigenous knowledge-based. Early childhood educators should be given the tools and opportunities for continuous professional learning of Indigenous knowledge. The first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation took place on September 30th, 2021. It is also known as Orange Shirt Day. This day honors the lost children and survivors of residential schools. The risk with having just one day or 1 week a year dedicated to truth and reconciliation is that Indigenous knowledge is not included for the rest of the year. Interestingly, this day is a federal statutory holiday, and the message that I'm hearing from that is that change will not come from our governments. It should come from us. So here are my calls for action. Required Indigenous courses for ECE students. We can't teach something that we know nothing about. Required continuous professional learning for early childhood educators about Indigenous knowledge. Rewrite how this learning happened and other early years resources with Indigenous leaders and communities. If it's done for elementary and high schools, it can be done for early childhood educators as well. So what can we do? Write, call, or email Stephen Lecce, Ontario's Minister of Education, and Primer Doug Ford about the need for Indigenized how this learning happened and resources for the early years. Create a petition calling the Ontario government to follow these calls. Ask other educators to send a letter and sign the petition. Create infographics that explain the current issue and calls for action. Share them on social media. Create a hashtag for social media like TRCWhere. Share your story. What are you seeing in childcare now? Why is it important to you? In my placement, we have an Indigenous child, but aside from Orange Shirt Day, her culture is not celebrated at all. This would be something I would share when discussing the need for an Indigenized resources. And the final step, speak to your local friendship centers and involve them in your class curriculum planning. Attend webinars and available continuous education opportunities. Start the change in your classroom and let it spread out. And another final step, Seneca College has an Indigenous Knowledge Keeper to support the genuine understanding of Indigenous knowledge. Childcare centers could benefit from working closely with a knowledge keeper. To request this change, you can contact the Toronto Early Learning and Childcare Services and Mayor John Tory or your local municipality. And I just want to thank you for watching and end this presentation with a poem. The Indigenous concept of connectivity states that we are all connected and affect each other. It is only right that we advocate for this cause.